Hello, thank you all for joining in and welcome to the Building Interdisciplinary Research Careers in Women's Health Leadership webinar. I am Andrea Harriet, a headache medicine and vascular neurology subspecialist in the Department of Neurology at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School and a current Birch Scholar. I have the honor of moderating this session entitled The Science of Team Science, and the great pleasure of introducing today's speaker. I want to start by thanking the organizers of this program for affording me the opportunity to moderate this session. We hope this webinar will be both informative as well as interactive. I encourage you to submit questions in the chat, which we will discuss during the question and answer portion of today's discussion. With no further delay, I will introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Michelle Bennett. Dr. Michelle Bennett directs the Center for Research Strategy, a science-based office that since 2015 collaboratively develops recommendations for addressing scientific opportunities, monitors the direction and application of the NCI's scientific knowledge and resources, and identifies research funding gaps. Prior to taking on this role, she served as the Deputy Scientific Director of the Division of Intramural Research at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and before that was Deputy Director at NCI Center for Cancer Research. Dr. Bennett earned her PhD in oncology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, studying genetic susceptibility to cancer, and as a postdoctoral fellow at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, performed some of the earliest work on BRCA1 and BRCA2, including the characterization and localization of BRCA1 to the long arm of chromosome 17. Dr. Bennett has extensive practical experience in promoting collaboration and team-based approaches by bringing together research scientists with diverse backgrounds and expertise to solve complex scientific problems. She is a facilitator sought by individuals, teams, and institutions to help them devise strategies to promote collaboration and team-based approaches to scientific research. This work is conducted through seminars and workshops to help researchers better understand how they can apply strategies to build strong scientific teams. Dr. Bennett has supported efforts to increase diversity in the biomedical workforce, played a leadership role in launching and building the NIH Statman Tenure Track Investigator Program, and developed a trans-NIH web presence for the NIH Intramural Program. She is the recipient of many awards, including NIH and Institute Directors Awards, and NCI Women Scientist Advisors Achievement Award, and the NCI Exceptional Mentor Award. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Michelle Bennett. I know that we will have a lot to learn from her today. Dr. Bennett, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harriet. I appreciate the warm welcome and the introduction, and listening to you for so long makes me think I should develop a shorter version of my bio. But thank you anyway. That was really, very nice. So, well, why don't we leap into it? Thanks so much for the invitation to come today. I really, I think this is a really fantastic forum. The only thing that could be better is if there were some way to have us all together in one room. And at the same time, it's fantastic to, be able to meet with so many people across the country simultaneously. So just a real pleasure to be with you today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tee up my slides for you so that I can go through those. And I think I want to sort of preface my starting by just saying that, in preparation for this, I received a whole page full of questions, so many wonderful, thoughtful questions. I was just telling Dr. Harriet and Ego a few minutes ago that I could have probably designed a whole day workshop or 2-day workshop around all of the questions because they were so fabulous. I've done my best to integrate them into kind of segments, and I will try to speak to them. And I know I won't address everyone probably to the depth that you like. So I will also try to leave some time for questions. So let's just jump into it. The first thing, just to kind of give you background, I've been interested in team science and collaboration for well over a decade now. I became very interested in it when I was doing science. I definitely participated in team science when I was a postdoc and in my early career before I stepped away from the laboratory bench. And I've also been extremely interested in helping others develop teams, launch teams, and sustain teams over time. This is the field guide, which is freely available at the URL listed. The URL will actually redirect. So if you're interested in this, you can pull it down as a PDF Kindle version or EPUB. A lot of things that I'll be talking about are in there, but not everything. So I'm just going to say, so here are some of the questions that I received on my long list of questions. Some might be paraphrased or combined a little bit with others. But I think the way that I would say that, we're going to kind of get started here is, what do we need to think about? What do you need to think about when you're pulling together a team? Everything from, managing teams to the diversity of teams to big egos and trust. And so we'll talk about a lot of these things, and you'll see that some of these themes will also recur through the presentation. So the first thing I want to say is that it's typically the science that brings teams together. Your research, you in combination with somebody else, your research idea, you bring the team together in order to solve a complex scientific problem. One of the things that I want to really try to convey to you today is that it's not just the research going on. It's not just the goal to figure out what the answer is to that complex scientific problem, but there are a lot of other things that are going on the periphery. I think that are first hidden by the fact that there's so much excitement around the research. But there are things that the team really needs to tend to and focus on, such as vision and trust and institutional support and communication and sharing credit and setting expectations. Because if these things that surround the science are not done at the outset and throughout the process, people will oftentimes end up spending more time on the periphery managing personnel issues, disagreements, conflict. Sometimes teams dissolve. So the principle here is that by tending to a lot of these things that surround your research, you can actually grow the time that you can spend doing your research, knowing that the other things are managed and under control. This is sort of how I think about collaboration. And, there is a component of it that introduces threats to some people. And we're going to talk a little bit today about how to mitigate some of those threats. But, when we are trained, many of us, definitely my experience, when we're trained in science, we are trained to be independent and to have a self-identity. And then at some point, it's like, do I start to become interested in working with groups? And am I interested in becoming interdependent? There was a question on the previous slide, or the question slide, about ego. What do you do when people have really big egos? Sometimes we run across that in science and in other places. And, people with, big egos, you can think about them as having a very important self-identity and being very independent. And there are some people who just probably won't be interested in participating as a member of group. And I've come to say to people, that's fine. That's their choice. I think that if you can't make somebody collaborate, working with them the right way, if they really have an area of expertise that you want to tap into, there might be ways of doing that without them necessarily being part of the collaboration of the group. But really what we're asking people to do when they collaborate is move from self-identity to group identity, from independence to interdependence. This requires a lot of integration and interaction. And it also requires that, multiple people on the team step up and take different leadership roles. At least that's typically the case. And so things like status and power and autonomy that are important down in this realm, the self-identity independent, kind of have to expand and get broader and more inclusive. So trust, there's a mention about trust. Trust is probably one of the most important things that is related to building a team, putting a team together, and sustaining a team over time. If there isn't trust, it's going to be very difficult to have open and honest conversations. It's going to be very difficult to set expectations. It's going to be very difficult to achieve a shared vision if you're not 100% sure that you're on the same page with somebody, or you think that they might do something that's not in alignment or incongruent with how you're thinking about things. I knew that trust was really important when I started doing the work that I did to understand what contributes to successful team functioning. And I was actually amazed at how much there is to know about trust. But as I started working more and more with teams, I just started realizing more and more that trust really is so foundational that if trust starts to crumble, everything will start crumbling around it. You know, typically people are divided into two groups, more or less. People who start new relationships high trust, and people who start new relationships at low trust. And so you can just think about this for a moment in terms of what it means to start working with other people. If I start out high trust, I'm going to be looking at the other person to help sustain these high levels of trust. Prove to me that you continue to earn my trust and you deserve my trust. And on the flip side, if I start low trust, I'm going to look for you to, again, prove to me that you can be trusted, and that trust will build over time. The tricky thing about this is that I don't walk into a room and say, "Hi, I'm Michelle, I'm high trust." So you don't really know that, what is she thinking? What is she experiencing? And so I think it's good to have this in mind when you start new relationships. And if you wanted to, you could even make it an explicit part of getting to know each other. There are many different dimensions of trust. I'm just going to mention 3 of them pretty briefly. And these are the 3 that I think actually have most to do with team science and collaboration. One is called calculus-based trust, and this is built on the calculations of the relative rewards for trusting or losses for not trusting. So what does this mean? It means that if I make a promise to you and I keep it, you'll do the calculus in your head over time, and you'll see that every time I say I'll do something and I deliver, that I can be trusted, and that trust will build over time. If on the flip side I don't deliver something when I promised, and I don't deliver again and I don't deliver again, you'll be doing calculus in your head, and you'll be saying, she doesn't really deserve my trust, because when I give it to her, she betrays it by not delivering on what she's saying. So that's calculus-based trust. Competence-based trust, my best example of competence-based trust is when I was working in the laboratory. I was a postdoc, and there was a guy down the hall who I could always go to if I was having trouble with getting something to work. And I didn't really know him very well, but he was always so gracious. He was always willing to talk through an experiment with me, help me, kind of troubleshoot it. And we always seemed to be able to figure it out. Or maybe I should just say he figured it out, but made me believe I contributed to helping, which was really, really nice. So I had a lot of, I trusted his competence, even though I didn't know him very well. And then there's identity-based trust, which is the type of trust that you typically think of when you say the word trust. This is a type of trust that we kind of save for our most special relationships. There's a very close companion to trust, and it's called psychological safety. And psychological safety is, I've got sort of 3 descriptors of what psychological safety is. But basically, it's being able to show and employ oneself without fear of negative consequences of self-image, status, or career. You can kind of look at the other 2, but, over the last year, I've been hearing a quote a lot that comes from the DEI space, which is, diversity is being invited to the dance. Inclusion is being asked to dance. And then I've heard somebody say, and belonging is being able to dance like nobody's watching. And I really like that because I think that's what psychological safety is. It's the ability to be very comfortable with who you are in the environment you're in. So there was a woman by the name of Amy Edmondson who works at the Harvard Business School, and she's really an expert in psychological safety and has developed a 7-statement or 7-item assessment. And I've got the phrases listed here, and basically these are measured by using a Likert scale. And so if one wants to figure out, is my environment psychologically safe? Is my organization psychologically safe? Do I feel psychologically safe in my environment? You could set this up as a Likert scale and have people answer it. And I've done this a number of times with groups to try to get sort of a baseline of where they are with trust. And then we can do it later on to get a sense as to whether psychological safety has improved. But even if you read through these, and I won't read through them all, but if you make a mistake, it's often held against you. It's safe to take risks in this group. Nobody would deliberately act in a way that undermines my efforts. And working with members of the group, my unique skills and talents are valued and utilized. So I actually was invited to a very prestigious institution at the United States about a year and a half ago, and asked to give a presentation at their faculty retreat. So maybe around 300 faculty from across the organization. And I showed this slide, and I was really struck because at the end of my talk, 5 women came up to me and told me, Michelle, women do not have psychological safety at this institution. And it really crushed my soul, to tell you the truth. I think this is all very fundamental in how we should be able to expect to work together. So I think you're a great group to share this with, because you are the leaders of tomorrow, day after tomorrow, next week. And I think this is something that you can think about and take with you on your journey into leadership. So what are some of the other questions that I heard asked? What contributes to successful team functioning? How to launch and sustain teams over time? What are the major obstacles? How do I find and approach potential collaborators? And what do I need to have people want to collaborate with me? One of the most critical things that I think teams forget about is the importance of a shared vision or goal. And so why would I say that people forget about it? Because I have actually worked with the National Science Foundation on a particular set of projects that they have, where they bring in investigators, and they're really trying to groom these investigators in these projects to work collaboratively and to work as teams. And so they give them some seed money to work for some period of time, 9 months, a year, in order to kind of put together a proposal. So sort of like a planning grant, and then they can compete for a much larger pot of money to actually execute the project. And it has happened to me a couple of times that I've interacted with some of these planning teams, and I've asked them what their vision is, and they can't tell me. They haven't gotten to the point yet, 4 to 5 months in, where they're able to very clearly articulate the vision and goal for their project. And so that leads me to kind of be concerned about, I guess, and conveying to people that it's really important to be able to come up with your elevator ride speech. What are you going to say to the person who has $10 million in their back pocket when you're in the elevator with them, to encourage them to give that $10 million or at least $1 million to your project? So it's with a very strong vision that people will be interested in working with you and following you. And I think the other piece is that I think if people are clear about how it's going to be beneficial to both people, they'll be more likely to want to engage. If it's all about me and my project and you can help me, people aren't going to be quite as interested. So when we did some research to understand, again, what contributes to successful team functioning, one of the big takeaways that we learned is that in a team that's working really well, everyone can describe the big picture. Everybody understands the major goals. And all of the individual people on the team also understand their goals in the context of the larger vision. And when I say everybody, I mean everybody. This is from the administrators to the animal handlers to the technicians to the senior leadership. I think the summer students, just it's as you kind of get to I'd say as the level of experience of the individual increases, what you end up finding is that they have a more complete, larger picture. Some people's pictures are more so their piece and maybe another piece, but I think the vision is really critical. I wanted to share quickly with you the model of team development. And this is a model that was established by Bruce Tuckman in the 1960s, and he added to it in the 70s. I'm really going to just focus on the forming, storming, norming, and performing, which was part of his original model. So the cool thing about this model, maybe, is that the names, these titles rhyme. And so at the end of my lecture, if you don't remember anything, maybe you'll remember these terms when you're telling somebody at dinner tonight. But he really identified these stages. And, so forming is one of them, kind of makes sense. The team comes together. The team then has to go through a storming phase. And it's very similar to what it looks like and what it sounds like. This is a period where people don't get along. They might not trust each other. They might say, get out of my space. You're encroaching on my stuff. And that's really because people don't understand yet what their roles and responsibilities are in the context of the team. It's confusing, lines are fuzzy. And so that's what really people need to work on during the storming phases, to kind of figure everything out. Norming is where the norms of the group are formed. It becomes clear how we're going to work together, what we're going to say to each other, how we're going to operate together. And then that kind of tees us up for the performing stage, where I kind of liken this to a well-oiled machine where everything's humming. So back to storming, which I think is probably the most important step. And the reason I think it's the most important step is because you can't get to norming unless you go through storming. And when we come together as a team, as a group, we tend to not want to enter into conflict. We think of conflict as being really negative, something that needs to be avoided. And so we try to seek harmony, right? We want everybody to be happy. Well, when you want everybody to be happy, usually nobody's happy, or at least they only stay happy for a short time. And so the idea around the storming is to surface the differences, surface the things that aren't working, talk about what works, but also talk about what's not working, so you can work through that so that you can get to the norming phase. The other thing is the storming phase is not optional. You have to go through it to get to norming. And if you don't, what tends to happen is the team just tends to fall apart. And anytime anybody leaves the team or joins the team, you're going to go through another little cycle of storming. And then finally, you can have storming happening at different levels. It can be happening within a small team and a big team at this, kind of simultaneously, but at different points, sort of at asynchronous points around the circle. So I think that's just good to know. And it's really helpful, at least for me, to know that storming's totally normal. And, the more you embrace it, the quicker you'll get through it. The greater the proportion of experts a team had, the more likely it was to disintegrate into non-productive conflict or stalemate. So this is a great quote, I think, from a Harvard Business Review. And, it's basically what it says is, this is what can happen to researchers as they start to think that, that they are an expert and they don't need to learn more from other people. And this can be an element of storming, and this can be an element of what gets a team stuck. And somebody asked about ego earlier. The more we are open to learning, the more researchers are open to exploring new areas, hearing from others, the more productive it's going to be for the team. So some more questions: how to manage the team, conflict management, how do we navigate authorship? What about sharing, credit, resources, reagents, and what should junior faculty be considering? So I thought this would be a good point in time to really talk about expectations. I once had a junior faculty member come to me and tell me about this horrible thing that was happening in her lab. She had hired a technician. The technician came in at 9 a.m. and left at 5 p.m. and things seemed to be going pretty well. Then the technician started coming in at 9:30, leaving at 4:30, coming in at 10, leaving at 4, and they just kept kind of narrowing the time that they were spending at work. And I said, well, how have you talked to the technician about this? What kind of expectations have you set? And she said, well, I haven't talked to him about it at all. And I said, well, if he doesn't know what your expectations are, he's going to do more or less what he wants, which is what he was doing. And she was surprised that she could even do that. She could even be that clear with them. And so setting expectations is a great way, especially in team science, but really any place you're actively working, to get some clarity and agreement between you and the other person about how you're going to manage all of these different things that need to happen in the context of the research project or a laboratory or a team setting. So things like communications, authorship, etc. So I tend to be a pretty big proponent of a couple of different types of documents. I typically think of them being used one or the other, but they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. There is an investigator at the NIH who developed a welcome to my lab letter, and my collaborator Howard Gadlin and I riffed from that and used it to think about a welcome to my team letter. And what it really does is it's a letter to the team about what the leaders expect from the team, what the team can expect of the leaders, and what we do if we disagree. So everything's written out. It provides that opportunity to think through all of that very carefully. Another type of agreement is a collaborative research agreement. My collaborator, Howard Gadlin, used to call these prenuptials for scientists. And he used to say that because there are no two people more foolish than people falling in love than two scientists starting a collaboration. So he used to tease that he was as the ombudsman, he served as the emergency room for failed scientific collaborations. But, some of the major headings on the collaborative agreement are, what are the goals and visions? Who's going to do what? How's authorship and credit going to be decided? Contingencies in communicating and conflict of interest. I have run into people who are very strongly, we need to make sure we've got criteria in place and an agreement early on about how we're going to decide authorship. And then I have people tell me, Michelle, you can't decide who the authors are going to be until all the work's done and you're about ready to write the paper. I actually think that it's much better to talk about some criteria ahead of time and keep that conversation alive over time. And so this is one way where you can start to have that conversation and memorialize it in some way. The other type of agreement that I think is really helpful this day and age, especially because I think research institutions across the country recognize that team science and collaboration are not going away. This is how science is evolving. Not only are single author papers almost non-existent anymore, whereas they used to be the coin of the realm. I mean, I think if people see a single investigator, they are almost questioning that paper more. But I think how to really recognize and reward people in this space is becoming a greater dialogue. And so thinking about either developing offer letters, and I have helped people write offer letters that have integrated team science and collaboration language into it. So basically saying, kind of teeing it up in the offer letter so that when the person does eventually come up for promotion and tenure, they can point to the criteria under which they were hired. So it's not like it's a secret. And the other component is that once hired, I will oftentimes encourage people to set up pre-tenure agreements with the institution. And that's because if they're being expected to collaborate, then they can articulate that very clearly in the pre-tenure agreement. And again, get recognized and rewarded for their contributions to team science, as opposed to at the tenure decision time being told that that they really haven't clearly established independence. And you can definitely identify independence in the context of a team. You just have to know how to do it. So what else were in the questions? So how to manage conflict, how to work with and manage many different personality types. What qualities does a successful leader of interdisciplinary teams possess? Can a junior faculty member play a leadership role? So we're going to kind of tackle some of this. So let's see. So so I guess I would say that I'm a proponent of doing assessments. I think it's really helpful for your own professional development, your own personal development, to become more clear about who you are as a person, how you operate, what your strengths are, what your, let's say, non-strengths are. I don't like to say weaknesses, but we could talk about them as things that just zap your strength, that leave you feeling just like completely washed out. And why I think assessments are valuable is because it helps us move from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence. Okay, now I recognize that I'm pretty bad at this, or I can't do this very well, which, is okay. And I will have to admit, there are some things that I've learned about that I'm not that great at. And I've said, that's fine with me. I don't really care if I get better or not. That's not one of the areas I want to focus on. But those areas I do want to focus on, I say, wow, okay, so I work very hard to become consciously competent. I, learn how to do it, put a lot of time and effort into it. And then one day I realized, wow, I'm doing this without even thinking, which is like really cool. You're like, wow, I've really made some progress. And so when we do this with ourselves, we learn a lot. And the other reason that I think assessments are really valuable is that as we learn more about ourselves, we actually end up learning more about other people as well. And I think that really helps in the context of team science, especially when you think back to, are all of the team members using their strengths and their talents on the team? Why have people join the team, or why ask people to be on the team if you're not going to leverage, their greatest strengths and their greatest talents and their greatest abilities? And certainly I would want to bring mine to the team. One of the assessments that I will oftentimes do with people is called the Thomas Kilmann Conflict Mode Indicator. And it's really an assessment that helps assess your conflict style in 2 dimensions, along self-assertiveness from high to low and cooperativeness low to high. And it breaks things down into 5 different dimensions. There are people who tend to avoid conflict more. They tend to compete more, which means that they have a I'm going to win this battle mentality and really will jump in there. There's the accommodate mode, which is more like, well, I'll just leave it up to you. I'll do what you want. I'll do what you want. Compromise is sort of a nobody wins sort of place where each person might get a little bit. And then there's the collaborate mode, which takes a lot more energy and time than some of the other ones. But doing an assessment like this, again, gives you a sense of where you have your strengths, where you're comfortable, and most importantly, where you tend to go to when you're tired or you're angry or you're hungry or you're lonely. So when we're not at our best, we tend to move to our comfort zones. And so if my comfort zones are avoid and accommodate, and I'm working really hard to be more collaborative and more compromising, when I get really tired, I'm going to retreat back to where I'm comfortable. And so even knowing that about myself is helpful. And then knowing how other people operate is really helpful too. This is just a descriptor of each of these. And so I usually send my slides around. This is being recorded too, so if something, and certainly you could find these online, but it just in more detail describes each of the different conflict styles and gives you a sense of what they mean. And when I have a chance to work with groups for, a few hours to do a workshop, sometimes we do this exercise, which is a lot of fun. Unilateral control and mutual learning. So I'm going to introduce you to next two mindset elements. So, we talk a lot about the behaviors, right, that we need in order to be successful at collaborating. And the behaviors are great and they're important, but if we want to have behaviors that are very collaborative in nature, very open, where we're transparent, we can have difficult conversations, and we're operating from what's called a unilateral control approach, which is the mindset element. So mindset comes before behaviors. Your mindset influences your behaviors. So if I'm operating from a unilateral control mindset, it's going to be very difficult for me to be very collaborative in a very positive way. So what leads me to say this? So of the two mindsets, I think the unilateral control mindset is the mindset we learn to adopt by the age of about 5. And so why would we adopt this mindset? We adopt this mindset because this is very much the world we live in. And this is how we protect ourselves. This is how we stay safe. This is how our schools work. This is how our institutions work. So we're exposed to this from very early on. So the values of the mindset for unilateral control are win, don't lose, be right, minimize expressions of negative feelings, and act rational. The assumptions are, I understand, those who disagree don't. I am right, those who disagree are wrong. I have pure motives, those who disagree don't. My feelings and behavior are justified, and I'm not contributing to the problem. So just imagine that you're standing in front of 2 rooms, and in both these rooms, the same topic is going to be discussed. You're going into a meeting, it's a high stakes meeting, it's very controversial, the topic, a decision needs to be made, and there are going to be a lot of different people in the room with a lot of different perspectives. So you can go into the unilateral control approach room and participate in that meeting, or you can go into the mutual learning room. So mutual learning is a very different approach, and again, this is the mindset. So this is a mindset where you have very different values and assumptions that you're operating from which your behaviors are derived. So values for the mutual learning mindset are transparency, curiosity, informed choice, accountability, and compassion. The assumptions are, I have information, so do other people. Each of us sees things others don't. People may disagree with me and have pure motives. Differences are opportunities for learning, and I may be contributing to the problem. So this is all work that's based on work done by Roger Schwartz and his associates. He has built his work upon that of Chris Argyris and Ed Schein, and others from before him. A lot of that was, I think, done at Harvard as well. And I think having learned about this has been a really pivotal for me, both in my career as well as in my personal development, coming to appreciate this. And so, think about now you can go into one of the 2 rooms. Which room would you rather be in? I've only had one person put the unilateral control room once, and they put in parentheses, I love challenges. So I said, go for it, more power to you. So on from here, questions about leadership, effective leadership for teams. And I actually don't really exclude this from participating in teams either. And the reason I don't is because I think that every participant of a team is also a leader in some way, shape, or form. And I think that's one of the greatest opportunities of working as a team. So we talked a lot about self-awareness already, and self-awareness helps build the awareness about things that are happening around you. shared responsibility for success, being accountable for issues and problems, mentoring others, managing up and managing across, creating a safe environment. So this is the psychological safety and the trust. Being able to have a difficult conversation. I think if there's any one thing that you all could spend some time doing is learning how to have a difficult conversation. You're going to have a lot of them, especially if you're looking to become leaders of organizations. And the better you can do that, the more beneficial it's going to be for you, your team, your organization, your people. Being able to speak up and challenge ideas, giving your best every day, and serving as a role model. I think sometimes leaders forget that people are watching them very, very closely. So for example, if I am a leader at your organization and I say X, but I do Y, everybody's going to know it. And you're going to say, she says X, but she does Y. So what kind of role model is that, right? So we have to be really mindful as leaders that, that what people won't do what we say, they'll do what we do. And I think, again, that's an important component. The most productive, innovative teams are led by people who are both task and relationship oriented. Once more, these leaders change their style during the project. This is from another Harvard Business Review article, and I just am noticing now that I forgot the citation. Apologies for that. The reason I think that this is such a critical quote and statement is that, a lot of times scientists are promoted or put in charge of teams or given the opportunities they are because of their proficiency in and expertise in a particular area of science. They're assigned because of their strength in the task component of the work, the conduct of the science, not always because they are very relationship oriented. And basically what this quote says is that, a leader can start out by being assigned to lead a team or co-lead a team. And it's those leaders who, if they are focused on task initially, that they can develop that relationship orientation over time, that they can be very, very effective. But the ones who can't end up having more trouble than the others. So this relationship component of the teamwork is just as important as the project science focus. I hope that made sense. I think one of the things that I'd kind of like to leave you with today is, all this stuff about how do you manage conflict, how do you deal with diversity, how do you deal with people who are so different. I'd like to suggest to you that when you're interacting with people, whether it's one-on-one or in groups, that you think of every idea that they share with you as a gift. And why would I say that? I say that because we are really, in the sciences, we tend to be really horrible at accepting gifts. So what do I mean by that? I'm going to drill down even deeper. So if I'm in a meeting, and this has happened to me, if I'm in a meeting and I throw out an idea and somebody says, oh, that's a good idea. Or they say, oh, that'll never work. Or they say, how are you going to do that? That's like throwing my gift, my idea, that big red box with a beautiful yellow bow on the ground and stomping on it. How long am I going to want to offer up my ideas to this group if I keep hearing, oh, that's not going to work. We're not interested. We're going to do something else. But if somebody were to say, wow, Michelle, that's an interesting thought, knowing that it might not be the greatest thought in the world, but hey, does anybody else have another thought that might be aligned with that? Or can you build on that? Can we make that better? That's what I mean by ideas as gifts, is I think it's very much how we interact with people and how we respond to people and how we make space for them in the room and in our lives and in the projects that we're conducting. And so that's sort of my invitation to you. Especially, if you take anything away from this talk, I'd like you to take away one of these boxes with a pretty bow And just remember to open gifts when people give them to you. And I think the simplest way to do that is probably with curiosity or even just a brief tell me more. So just to close out, this again is the field guide, and you've seen that already. So we can certainly move to taking some questions if you like. And I appreciate the opportunity to share this with you today. Should I stop sharing my screen at this point, or what should I do?
Yeah, I think that's fine. You can stop sharing your screen. Thank you so very much for that talk. It was so incredibly insightful, and I know I personally learned so much. So I'm sure that the participants also learned a great deal about team science. I invite all of the participants to place their questions in the chat if you have any individual questions for Dr. Bennett, for our speaker. Please place them in the chat. I was particularly interested in this idea of the forming, storming, norming, performing. I think that was a really great way of structuring how to begin to formulate teams. And I thought it was really interesting when you mentioned, that the team starts with the science, and that everyone on the team should know the bigger picture and what the team's vision is. And I thought all of that was incredibly thoughtful, and really thank you for such an interesting discussion. So for some of the questions that were sent ahead of time, why don't we start by tackling some of the questions that were sent in previously?
Absolutely. Sounds great.
We've already gone through a good number of them. So one question talks about budget.
Yeah.
That team science can be very expensive, and it can be difficult to factor in team science when you're dealing with grants and budget. Any particular suggestions on how to navigate the cost of team science?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there are a couple of opportunities at the NIH, for example. So there's the multi-PI grants. And I think there's a recognition that they're a pretty good deal for the NIH to have two PIs working collaboratively and having them split the money. So, sometimes you could think about enhancing that budget a little bit to get a little bit more out of it, given that the money will be divided. I think the other things that you can do is, keep your eye out for opportunities for RFAs, funding announcements that include things that are actually requiring team science or collaboration. So those would be things like the U54 mechanisms, or center types of grants, or planning grants for putting together a larger program. And then the one that I think that some institutes provide an opportunity to compete for, the PO1s. And a PO1 is typically maybe 3 or 4 RO1s that kind of sit underneath the umbrella of sort of an administrative hub and an administrator. And I think those are great opportunity for team science. They come with a lot more money because each of the projects is sort of funded as a whole. The challenge there is I think as was stated, it's very difficult to apply for and get something like that funded out of the box. So that's where the program directors come in. If you do not have, or you haven't thought about the value in interacting with the program directors at NIH, you should all be able to identify a program director. You should talk to them once a month. You should have conversations with them. And if you're interested in putting together a team science type of a project, talk to them about how to do it. Ask their help in navigating and figuring it out, because I think they're the ones who can really help you not only guide the process, but they can also be champions for you as well. So those are just a few thoughts.
That's wonderful. Another question, how do you make sure that mentees don't get lost in a large team science environment, particularly early career investigators? How do you make sure that they don't get lost in all of the larger names or the other folks that are involved in the team?
I want to say just don't lose them. Um, I guess my thinking around that one is that's where being really explicit is helpful, right? And to come up with some agreements about, especially the mentees, how are the PIs going to make sure that they're tending to the career growth and development of the mentees? And I think being very purposeful and very explicit about that, not just among themselves, but with the mentees, is really, really important. Um, it can be easy to get lost. And at the same time, I think if the team takes the time to figure out how are we going to share credit, how are we going to make sure that the mentees are getting what they need out of this, how are they going to bolster their CVs, how are they going to get speaking opportunities. I think one of the coolest things about team science, at least I'm pretty sure, I've never met a team where this hasn't happened, but a lot of times new ideas get spun out, right? You have a new idea. It's like, oh, we need somebody to champion this idea. I mean, you can give projects to mentees. You can give projects to, grad students or postdocs. You can give projects and say, here, take the lead on this, get this started, get this going. And that doesn't happen like if you're just kind of working more in the context of an R01 probably. So I don't know. What did I miss? Did I miss anything?
I think you covered it. You mentioned in your talk the collaborative research agreement and some ways to avoid issues related to expectations and how to build expectations within the team. What do you do if a member of your team isn't meeting expectations? So let's say, you've done assessments, your team is going along, they have certain expectations, and then you find that that particular team member isn't meeting that expectation. Then what do you do?
You hold them accountable, right? I mean, the expectation is that they'll hold themselves accountable. If you need to hold them accountable, then you need to do this. And this is where we circle back to those difficult conversations, right? I know I said it earlier, but like learning how to have a difficult conversation is so critical. So I think one thing that I've learned over the last maybe year and a half is that one of the things that trips us up so badly when we're having difficult conversations is that we forget about the data. And that what I mean by that is, I think, so it's really cool because everybody on this call is a scientist, right? So when you make a conclusion or you make an interpretation about an experiment, you're doing it based on your data, right? You wouldn't just throw out a hypothesis and then say, so that's right, is it? Because we don't work that way. So it's the same way with difficult conversations. Where's your data? So find the data. So if you're having a difficult conversation with somebody, I don't want to make it sound like it's simple because I know it's not, but what's the observation that you've made? What are the data points? On Thursday, on Friday, on Tuesday, this and this and this happened. And you check in with them, do you see it differently? This kind of goes back to that mutual learning. I see it this way, but you got to ask the other person, how are you seeing it? Right? And so they say, well, actually, I see it the same way. And then it's like, well, what are we going to do? Or if they say, I see it differently, say, well, how are you seeing it differently? What's different? Because I think if you can reduce it down to the data, that prevents you from making stories up in your head, right? And it's when we start making those stories up in our head that we start, making misattributions, we start making assumptions. And then, next thing you know, it's like, I've decided that somebody hates me and they're trying to destroy my career when all they said is, Michelle, I think we should get together and talk, right? So, I think, again, difficult conversations, it's really important to learn how to do them. I used to tell people that I'm terrible, just terrible at difficult conversations. I have graduated to not bad. I think it's a lifelong pursuit.
So I think we have time maybe for one more question. You mentioned in your talk creating an elevator speech, pitch, to sort of get people engaged in a research idea when you're starting to build your team or thinking about building your team. Any other thoughts about how to market yourself as an expert in the field to gain collaborators, particularly for junior investigators or early career investigators?
Yeah, this is a really great question. You know, I think this probably, you know, the best advice I have for people is to kind of network. You know, something I will oftentimes say to advocates, and I have tended to do a lot of work with breast cancer advocates, is they'll tell me that they'd be interested in talking to a researcher. And I say, well, have you ever contacted one? I can't do that. Why not? Well, they're a researcher, they're a scientist. It's like, yeah, well, they're people too, right? And so I say, you know, I bet that a scientist would be so flattered to be contacted by you and asked if they would have time for a talk. Would they give a tour of your lab? And they're just amazed by that. And I think I would say the same thing is, you know, go out and introduce yourself to people. You know, make an appointment to talk to a PI or, you know, some other colleague that you admire that you think you could have a great conversation with. And it doesn't always have to be at the outset, like, will you collaborate with me, right? It can be just, you know, I've got this idea on this research project and I'm trying to get some advice from different perspectives. Would you be willing to chat with me about my project? And I think, I don't know, I just think it's one of those spaces that sounds kind of like scary to venture into, but go for it.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Dr. Bennett, for today's webinar and talk. It was so chock full of wonderful pearls for those of us that want to do team science, and certainly team science is absolutely critical, right, for everything, not only basic science, clinical research, all of the research that we do. All of our fields sort of move towards collaboration and team science. So it's so incredible to have these tools available to us. And I just wanted to thank you so much for your leadership and expertise and for sharing all of these wonderful tools with us today. It's absolutely wonderful to have you as our guest speaker today. So I wanted to thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Harriet. I very much appreciate the invitation, and it's been a lot of fun chatting with you here at the end. I appreciate all the questions from the group.
I also wanted to ask the attendees to remember to complete the survey that will appear in your window upon exiting the webinar. And also, please stay tuned for the announcement on the next speaker and date for our upcoming webinar. Thank you so very much again for the Birch program. This was sponsored by Emory University, so thank you so much for inviting me to moderate the science of team science.